The word prolific more than applies to television legend Norman Lear, the visionary behind any number of memorable TV shows. But prolific hardly conveys the pivotal role he played in transforming this medium.
In 2023, Norman Lear passed away at the age of 101. For days, his family remained silent as they planned an unexpected event. The startling truth was revealed 2 years later. His humble lifestyle belied a hidden art collection valued at more than $50 million. In reality, his house in Beverly Hills was a private museum with works by well-known artists. It wasn't the biggest surprise, though. Hollywood was taken aback by the stipulations attached to his $200 million mansion. The money could not simply be passed on to his 6 children. In ways that altered the very concept of family wealth, they had to earn it. On July 27, 1922, Norman Lear was born in New Haven, Connecticut, into a household already characterized by chaos. A hustler, his father, Herman Lear, engaged in phony bonds and schemes that made more promises than they could keep. Norman had to grow up quickly after his father was imprisoned for fraud when he was just 9 years old. Whispers at family get-togethers, visits to the penitentiary, and the abrupt expectation that he take on the position of man of the house all profoundly influenced him. He never truly recovered from those early injuries. He would channel those experiences into characters like Archie Bunker years later, whose imperfections and raucous demeanor mirrored the turmoil of his own father. Even earlier was the lesson that the American dream may easily become a nightmare. At one point, Herman started a furniture business, took advance payments from families, and then disappeared with their money. Norman witnessed the shame that descended upon his own family and the wrath of neighbors who had put their faith in his father. It was a cruel education in addition to a scandal. Norman has had a keen eye for the dark side of ambition and the fissures behind power ever since. His satirical television, which frequently peeled the exterior of respectability to reveal what was behind, would eventually be fueled by that perspective. At the age of 20, Norman enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces to serve in World War II in 1942. He flew 52 combat missions over the Mediterranean as a radio operator and gunner aboard Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. There was always a risk. Norman continued to fly even though tail gunners often only made it through a few missions. He flew past communities devastated by the Holocaust, witnessed friends die, and saw the skies become deadly with fire. He became determined to combat prejudice and bigotry wherever he could as a result of the hatred he saw. In addition to hardening him, the war provided him the sense of urgency that he eventually reflected in his writing. Norman returned home after the war, looking for guidance. Confident that it would lead to Hollywood, he applied to USC Film School. Rather, he was turned away. He started selling encyclopedias door to door as he had no other choice. Although it appeared to be a failure, the experience served as a training ground. He learned how to read people in a matter of seconds and craft a compelling story with each knock on a stranger's home, as well as how to attract attention in a living space. Unbeknownst to him at the time, this work equipped him with the means to reach millions of people when he made it on television. He gambled nearly everything he had left in 1945 when he was broke and unsure. He purchased a ticket to see comedian Danny Thomas perform in Miami with just $40 in his pocket. Norman managed to talk his way backstage after the show and persuaded Thomas to pay him $50 each week to create jokes. It was a daring action that made all the difference. A struggling soldier became a writer whose work would eventually influence American culture as a result of that period. His career almost ended before it had started with his first major television gig. Norman was brought on as a writer for the Ford Star Review variety show in 1950. In an instant, what ought to have been his breakthrough became a nightmare. Variety expressed dissatisfaction about the show's infrequent success. Additionally, a different critic claimed that his sketches had become mediocre. In reviews, the adjective unwatchable kept coming up. The show was nearly canceled by NBC management. Norman also contemplated completely abandoning television. Nevertheless, he remained. He He learned perseverance and the importance of candid criticism from that traumatic setback, lessons that he carried with him throughout his life. Soon after, he and his partner, Ed Simmons, began writing for Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin on the Colgate Comedy Hour. Although the pair was a sensation in front of the public, their collaboration was failing behind the scenes. Norman witnessed the altercations, ego conflicts, and final split that brought an end to one of the most well-known comedic acts. He learned how conflict can inspire creativity from witnessing that mess. Later, he employed the same dynamic in series like The Jeffersons and All in the Family, where opposing viewpoints produced enduring television. Norman was contributing to The George Gobel Show by the middle of the 1950s. He made a discovery here that will shape his career. Polite applause was given to safe, easy chuckles. However, the laughter grew louder and lasted longer when a skit challenged conventions or unnerved the audience. Norman came to the realization that humor, even when it was difficult to hear, had greater impact when it was honest. It was the beginning of what he dubbed humor with consequence, a style that would go on to transform comedies in the United States. He discovered the cost of honesty in 1958. He included gags criticizing the persistent dread of McCarthyism when composing for The Andy Williams Show. He was abruptly cut off by network advertisers and censors, and he was sacked within months. For Norman, losing his job meant more than just not getting paid. It proved that people who desired safe, meaningless entertainment would always disagree with him. His stubborn mentality would become the core of his profession because he refused to give up. He co-founded Tandem Productions with Bud Yorkin later that year. Initially, networks that favored polished, happy stories rejected their work as being too realistic. However, Bud and Norman were unwilling to make concessions. They preferred shows that depicted genuine hardships rather than idealized portrayals of reality. Eventually, Sanford and Son, All in the Family were born out of that perseverance, as well as The Jeffersons. A concept from across the Atlantic serves as the starting point for the tale of Norman Lear's ascent to prominence on American television. Lear discovered the British sitcom Till Death Us Do Part in the 1960s. It was a scathing comedy about a working-class man whose opinions were as provocative as they were incisive. Some claim that Lear learned about it from a variety of sources. Others, however, think that Carol O'Connor, who visited the UK, contributed to the idea's introduction to America. In any case, Lear was certain that it could succeed in the US. The networks have no interest in getting involved. A show that openly ridiculed racism, misogyny, and politics frightened executives. Lear and his group made 47 unsuccessful pitches for the idea. They went so far as to film 2 pilots for ABC. Those were The Days in 1969 and Justice for All in 1968. They were both turned down. For a country accustomed to the sweet families of programs like The Brady Bunch, executives believed the main character was too hazardous, too harsh, and too politically incorrect. Lear rewrote, recast, and begged for 4 years before CBS ultimately took a chance. Even so, it only occurred because the network had recently gotten rid of its rural comedy in an effort to update its image. Although it was given with trembling hands, the green light permanently altered American television. Archie Bunker's casting almost put a stop to the film before it even started. Actress Carol O'Connor, who had classical training, was really uncomfortable portraying such a racist man because he was concerned that, rather than making fun of bigotry, the character may actually reinforce it. 3 times O'Connor left talks because he thought the character was too unattractive for humor. It was only after several discussions that Lear convinced him that Archie would reveal ignorance rather than support it. Later on, O'Connor acknowledged that it was the most difficult work he had ever done. Because Archie was so realistic to American audiences, he had to maintain his role at all times and never take a break. He was recognizable to people from their own families. Even though it almost never happened, O'Connor's performance ended up being the highlight of the show. CBS officials were so terrified when All in the Family eventually debuted on January 12, 1971, that they contemplated canceling it only hours before it was scheduled to run. The program aimed to introduce discussions on gender, race, and class into living rooms that had never seen them on TV before. CBS broadcast a disclaimer to warn viewers. It clarified that in order to demonstrate how ridiculous human prejudices were, the program will expose them in a sophisticated and amusing manner. The panic continued despite the disclaimer. Executives were concerned about boycotts by advertisers, government inquiries, and irate letters. Their suspicions were validated. Although the premiere caused instant controversy, it also demonstrated that the nation was prepared for a new form of television. The disputes only intensified. The fifth episode of the first season of the show created history by using the word damn in an unfiltered way for the first time on American primetime television. In just a few weeks, viewers sent CBS 6,000 complaint letters, the most the network had ever received. Hearings on decency in television direction were undertaken after the commotion reached Congress. Every line of every script was inspected by censors from that point on. What may seem innocuous now was a shockwave in 1971 that made society consider how far entertainment might go. At first, the ratings appeared to support the network's skepticism. The program debuted at number 54 out of 96. However, a growing number of individuals watched the summer replays due to the storm of controversy. All in the Family was the most popular show in America by the end of the first season. It was the first show in Nielsen history to hold that position for 5 consecutive years. Once on the verge of cancellation, a series became a nationwide conversation, starting cultural phenomenon. Lear continued to push the envelope. Maude's Dilemma, a 2-part episode of his show Maude, aired in November 1972. 2 months before Roe v. Wade made abortion legal across the country, it described a 47-year-old woman's decision to have one. Nationwide, the ruling caused a stir. Thousands of angry calls were placed to CBS affiliates. Bomb alarms were reported at network offices, and Lear received death threats. Catholics were urged to boycott CBS and its sponsors after the Vatican openly denounced the program. Unwilling to give in despite this pressure, he maintained that media had a responsibility to represent the reality of these decisions faced by real women. Families, angry church officials, and even the show's authors were split by the repercussions, but Lear refused to back down. Maude became one of the most contentious television programs in American history after the episodes debuted. Lear's first sitcom about a black family living in a Chicago housing project debuted in 1974. It was first hailed, but shortly after, organizations like the MBNU, ACP, and human rights advocates began to denounce it. The humor, they claimed, relied too much on cliches and over-the-top depictions of criminality and poverty. The character's catchphrase, "Dinno meat," gained enormous popularity. However, detractors claimed that it made the show into a farce that disparaged black families. John Amos in Esther Roll, who portrayed the parents, fiercely resisted. Rolick cautioned that the show's viewers needed to think that they could dream outside of the game. In addition to forcing CBS to change plots, the argument sparked national discussions about how black life was portrayed on television. When Tom and Helen Willis, a black man and a white lady, shared an on-screen kiss in The Jeffersons, another big success, it broke down barriers. Many Southern television stations declined to broadcast the episodes since interracial marriage was still uncommon on American television. According to records, CBS lost millions of dollars in advertising revenue when 67 affiliates declined. In conservative areas, sponsors withdrew their backing. However, the network and Lear declined to alter the scenario. Although it also demonstrated how sharply divided the country still was, the kiss was a daring declaration of equality. In 1976, Lear and Mary Hartman once more pushed the boundaries of television. Hartman? Mary? He took the uncommon step of selling it directly to independent stations after it was rejected by all 3 major networks as being too odd and dangerous. With millions of viewers, it became the first successful nightly primetime syndicated program and established a new financial paradigm for programming with an adult subject. Its plots, which addressed despair, adultery, and even mass murder, both horrified viewers and won devoted fans. One of television's most notorious incidents was an episode in which a character drowned in a bowl of chicken soup. Norman Lear was at his best by 1977. 6 of his shows were broadcast in a single week. Good Times, One Day at a Time, Maude, The Jeffersons, The Family, and Mary Hartman. When combined, they accounted for almost 120 minutes of prime time, or over 13% of the weekly network schedule. No other producer had more than 2 successful shows airing at the time. Tens of millions of people watched Lear's shows every night. In a given week, more American people watched his broadcasts than went to church on Sundays or watched the evening news, according to a Nielsen study from 1975. He had greater influence on American society than most political politicians for a few years. Norman Lear was constantly attacked between 1980 and 1985 from the religious right's recent mobilization. The influential televangelist Jerry Falwell, who established the moral majority, targeted him out with an unrelenting personal campaign. Falwell referred to Lear as the American family's worst enemy and even the country's most dangerous individual. These were more than just headline-grabbing comments. They resulted in coordinated advertising boycotts that backed Lear's programs, including Mary Hartman, Maude, and All in the Family. The moral majority spearheaded national letter-writing campaigns, warning networks to block or cancel shows that mirrored Lear's secular and progressive views and pleading with big businesses to cease sponsorships. Falwell asserted that homosexuality, adultery, and incest were being pushed into American households by Lear's sitcoms. This was more than criticism for Lear. His name became a symbol of what conservatives referred to as cultural degradation, and it was a concerted movement that endangered the foundation of network television. The attacks become increasingly hazardous very soon. Lear was getting terrifying threats by 1981. According to other messages, if he continued to advocate what detractors referred to as anti-Christian values, he would be persecuted. It was a genuine worry. He joined forces with clergy and civil rights leaders to build people for the American way in retaliation. The organization rose to prominence as an advocate for civic and religious tolerance as well as the First Amendment. Politics wasn't the only factor. It was about defending both his life and his moral principles. The White House was hit by the animosity. The administration maintained an unofficial blacklist under Ronald Reagan against manufacturers who were thought to be antagonistic to American ideals. At the top of that list was Lear. Reagan's communications director said years later that the White House exerted pressure on sponsors and networks to cut ties with Lear. The intention was to quiet him and stop his funding. It was successful. A few of his programs were abruptly canceled or had to modify their criticism of authority. Race and religion. Early in the 1980s, television became more circumspect, and it became dangerous to create the political satire that had flourished under Lear. Lear was also having trouble adapting to the shifting preferences of American viewers. He introduced Gloria, a spin-off with Sally Struthers in 1982. However, the program only ran for 1 season. Lighter, escapist classics like Family Ties and The A-Team were too strong for it. Because of the optimistic atmosphere produced by the Reagan years, viewers preferred consolation to conflict. Lear's astute, socially aware style seemed out of place. Then his company was sold in a dramatic fashion. Tandem Productions was part of Embassy Communications, which Lear and his partner Jerry Parentio sold to the Coca-Cola Company in June 1985. The price, $485 million in stock and cash, was astounding. It was one of the biggest transactions in Hollywood history at the time. What appeared to be a victory quickly turned sour when Lear left the firm that had influenced American television. Coca-Cola sold off portions, dismantled the business, and mismanaged the assets. Bankruptcies ensued. Lawsuits were piling up. When Lear signed the contract, he had no idea that he would be exposed financially by the early 1990s. He suffered harsh repercussions from a business game he believed he had won when the empire he had established fell apart. When he and computer entrepreneur David Hayden purchased a rare Dunlap broadside copy of the Declaration of Independence at Sotheby's in 2000, Lear made news once more. The largest amount ever paid for an American historical document was $8.14 million. The public was astounded by the backstory. In 1989, The document was found concealed behind a $4 picture from a flea market. Lear refused to keep it hidden, despite criticism that he was transforming national history into a souvenir for the wealthy. Rather, he launched the Declare Yourself campaign, which enrolled millions of young voters and sent it on a 10-year tour throughout 50 states. The purchase meant civic participation to Lear. The question of whether such treasures should belong to specific people, however, has never been resolved. For Lear, the years after the sale of Embassy were difficult. He pitched at least 12 pilots between 1985 and the 1990s. They didn't pick one up. His shows were criticized by networks for being too traditional, too serious, or too topical. The man who was previously thought to have the most audacious voice on TV was now facing isolation. According to industry rumors, his time was over and the scathing, problem-focused sitcoms he produced were no longer acceptable. Then an unexpected turn of events occurred. Lear made an investment in Castle Rock Entertainment at the beginning of the 1990s. The business later produced Seinfeld. The show brought in about $1.05 billion when it went into syndication. Turner Broadcasting purchased Castle Rock in 1993. By 1999, Lear had amassed a fortune from his portion of the income. Following years of financial hardship, Seinfeld's popularity enabled him to reposition himself as a civic leader and philanthropist. His personal life was as complicated despite the significant changes in his job. He had 6 children from his 3 marriages. From 1943 to 1956, he was married to Charlotte Rosen for the first time. His second marriage, to Frances Loeb, garnered significant media coverage and lasted from 1956 to 1985. The marriage was surrounded by rumors of open relationships and Hollywood wife swapping in the 1970s and 1980s. Although Lear's third marriage to Lynn Davis in 1987 was more stable, rumors about his personal life persisted. Norman and Frances would quarrel in front of guests, creating a tense atmosphere in the Lear family, as his daughter Kate reportedly described. The cost of his divorce from Frances was among the highest in American history. Frances was awarded a settlement of $112 million in 1985. She launched a feminist journal called Lear's using some of her money, which totaled over $25 million. So, after the first edition sold out, 250,000 copies were distributed. It increased to 500,000 by the early 1990s. However, after significant expenditures and erratic leadership, the journal finally folded in 1994. Under the shadow of Lear's celebrity, his 6 children, Ellen, Kate, Maggie, Benjamin, Brianna, and Madeline, grew up, some acknowledged feeling left out, claiming that America had greater access to their father than his own family did. Later on, Lear acknowledged that he wasn't always there for them. Lear committed himself to self-discovery and therapy throughout this time. He referred to himself as a therapy junkie who experimented with everything from S-training to transcendental meditation and psychoanalysis. He acknowledged that treatment turned to become an obsession. However, he also thought it assisted him in facing his fear and forming the vision that characterized his work. In his own words, even when the challenges appeared insurmountable, he made the decision to press on, never allowing fear to stop him. Norman Lear made the decision to revive one of his own masterpieces in 2017. One Day at a Time, his sitcom from the 1970s, was recreated for Netflix, and many people pondered if, in a streaming-dominated future, the formula that once characterized primetime family programming would still hold true. It wasn't a simple success. Something fresh was produced. A Cuban-American family in Los Angeles, headed by a single mother who was also a veteran, was the focus of the show. It tackled pressing topics like immigration, structural racism, mental health, and LGBTQ+ acceptance, all while striking a balance between genuine passion and fun. Critics praised it as one of the best shows of 2017, and audiences adored it. In 2019 and 2020, the show won 2 Primetime Emmys for picture editing out of 4 nominations. Major Imaging Foundation prizes were also won by the cast. It was more than just a comeback to television for Norman Lear, who was 95 at the time. Also evidence that almost half a century after he created the first series, he was still able to transform the medium. It also ended up being his final major undertaking before he passed away in 2023. During the Trump administration, Lear emerged as one of Hollywood's most vocal voices, despite his return to scripted television. His age, as well as his remarks, startled a lot of people. He publicly referred to Donald Trump as a complete idiot well into his 90s, stating that Trump was the middle finger of the American right hand and likening him to his most notorious creation, Archie Bunker. He cautioned against prejudice, anti-immigrant attitude, and what he saw as a perilous nostalgia for a bygone era. He protested by declining to go to the White House ceremony for his Kennedy Center honor at the age of 95. Following his 100th birthday in 2022, he denounced Trump's anti-Semitic comments, claiming they reminded him of his early years when open hatred was prevalent. He demonstrated that age could not stifle commitment by combining his personal history with public engagement to create a potent voice for democracy. Lear wasn't done taking people by surprise. ABC broadcast live in front of a studio audience in 2019 and 2021, which revived Good Times, The Jeffersons, and All in the Family episodes. The enthusiasm of the 1970s was recreated by actors performing these legendary screenplays live on television in front of a studio audience. It was an electrifying response. Lear became the oldest person to ever win a Primetime Emmy in 2019 when she won the Emmy for Outstanding Variety Special at the age of 97. Thank you, he joked on stage. Holy shit. 90 years later, my feelings remain largely unchanged. A new generation was exposed to his incisive, socially concerned writing through the specials, and they learned how relevant his work was even today. Almost nobody was aware that Lear and his wife Lynn had been working behind the scenes to create a covert art collection. They discreetly gathered contemporary treasures by artists such as Willem de Kooning, Roy Lichtenstein, Ed Ruscha, David Hockney, and Robert Rauschenberg between the 1970s and 2023. Few understood the size or worth of their possessions for decades. Experts were taken aback when Christie's unveiled the collection in 2024. The final sales total exceeded $60 million, while the pieces were valued at above $50 million. Even insiders were taken aback by the disclosure, particularly because Lear had a reputation for leading a humble life. It came out that their house in Beverly Hills was more akin to a private museum. Massive artwork, such as a gigantic Rauschenberg that required a specially constructed wall of its own, was the focal point of the wall designs. The Lears frequently held exclusive events where celebrities, artists, and collectors could examine works that are rarely seen outside of large institutions. Occasionally, Lear himself would lead visitors around the home while narrating tales about the artwork. Intimate evenings rather than open displays fostered a feeling of connection between the work and those who were invited to view it. A Lawn Being Sprinkled by David Hockney was among the most well-known works. In 1978, Lear paid $64,000 for it, which was a significant amount at the time. It was predicted to sell for up to $35 million in 2024. The Lear collection's focal point was the picture, which depicted a straightforward scene of sprinklers watering a lawn. He had a keen sense of talent. He purchased the piece before to Hockney's whole ascent to international renown. And it continued to stand as evidence of Lear's extraordinary intuition for decades. Truth, a 1973 painting by Ed Ruscha, was another highly regarded work. It displayed the word truth floating in clouds of blue and white with scorching red lettering. For decades, Lear hung it over his writing desk, claiming it served as a daily reminder to him to tell truthful stories. He advised performers and friends that the ultimate goal of any storyteller is to speak the truth. The $9. 2 Million painting gained not just recognition as a work of art, but also as a catalyst for Lear's artistic development. The 7 largest pieces alone brought $60.02 million at Christie's when the collection was sold in May 2024. The Lear family promptly donated a large portion of the funds to organizations that were important to Norman, such as grassroots movements for social justice and voting rights, arts education, and People for the American Way. It was a daring move. demonstrating how charity would sustain Lear's activity. At the age of 101, Norman Lear passed away at home in Los Angeles on December 5, 2023. He was precisely 101 years and 131 days old. At first, his family planned a private service and managed every aspect of what was disclosed, keeping the news discreet. According to later insiders, this was planned so that his passing would not only be remembered, but also serve to emphasize his principles and unfulfilled ambitions. When the news was ultimately released, it included information about significant political contributions, a surprise inheritance arrangement, and philanthropic aspirations. Even Hollywood insiders were amazed by the family's ability to maintain secrecy in a world where leaks are commonplace. The actual inheritance scheme was unheard of in Hollywood. None of Lear's 6 children inherited anything directly. Rather, the estate, which was valued at an estimated $200 million, was put into trusts with stringent requirements. Distributions would only be made to each child if they pledged to perform years of public service, such as public interest journalism, civic involvement, or nonprofit employment. Their portion would be donated to charity if they declined. Lear thought that rather than being an entitlement, riches ought to be linked to significant contributions, and he wished for his kids to keep having an influence. Insiders in Hollywood referred to it as a model for a novel form of family heritage. His art continued to find new audiences even after his passing. Clean Slate, a series Lear had approved at the age of 100, was published by Amazon. It was about Harry Slate, an old-fashioned car wash proprietor from Alabama who gets back in touch with his child, Desiree, who is now a proud trans woman. After being away for more than 20 years, the first sitcom centered on a transgender lead character was this one, which starred Laverne Cox. It addressed discrimination and familial estrangement while retaining Lear's distinctive blend of candor and humor. It was hailed by critics who pointed out that Lear had once again pioneered television. According to behind-the-scenes interviews, the concept began as a reboot of Sanford and Son. However, thanks to Lear's perseverance, was transformed into a trans-inclusive tale. It demonstrated that he was still advancing television at the age of 100.